to today's program is titled COVID-19 Vaccine, What Employers Should Expect. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I would like to pass things over to Tracy Billows. Tracy, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited for you to be here today on our webinar. We know that this topic is one that many organizations are sort of trying to get their arms around and understand what are all the different considerations, laws, you name it. I'm so excited to be joined today by a number of our experts in this area. We have Tessa from London, who, by the way, it's 8 p.m. there. So she's already very late into her day. Imagine that for all of you, depending on where you're at in the world right now watching this. But the most impressive one is Paul, where it's already Friday in Sydney. It is 6 a.m. there. And Tessa and Paul are two of our preeminent international employment law partners. And we're so thrilled to be able to partner with them on our program today so that we can give you that holistic perspective of the vaccine questions that are out there, not just from a U.S. perspective, but an OUS perspective. And joining them is Senior Counsel Yana, who it's LA, so sorry, I'm not going to do anything fun with that time zone. We all know LA's time zone. But we are so thrilled to have her joining the team as well, too. We are excited to have also my partner, Carla, who has been at the forefront of these vaccine issues. I'm sure many of you have seen her blogs, her management alerts, you name it. So you are in for a great treat with Carla. And Condon, who has pretty much taught me almost everything I know about the ADA, who's going to be talking with you about Eeoc Guidance and a number of other issues that come up related to vaccines. And last, but definitely not least, we have Megan Toth, who's one of our preeminent accommodations gurus, and who's going to talk about how vaccines with respect to accommodations intersect and what does this mean for employers. So to kick us off, we actually have a polling question, and we promised to share the results with you. And so here we are. Here is the question to all of you. In regards to your company's COVID-19 vaccination plans, please indicate whether your company will likely do one of the following. A, require employees to get the COVID vaccine. B, encourage employees to get the COVID vaccine. Or C, not sure at this time. You can only pick one. I know Chicago, vote once, vote often. I get it, and I'm based in Chicago. But for purposes of our poll, you can only pick one, A, B, or C. Do get your answers in because we are going to show you these results live. And these results really will, ultimately help sort of frame some of the issues that we are going to be talking about today. In terms of looking at some of these issues, as you'll see on our agenda, we're going to be talking about Eeoc Guidance, which gets into both mandatory and non-mandatory considerations. Plus, that feeds into sort of what else do you need to be looking at from a mandatory versus a voluntary vaccine program? Are there pluses or minuses to certain ones? What are the legal considerations? Then we have our OSHA and CDC guidance, and then accommodations requests. So this is the first part of the agenda for the US portion, and then we will be getting to the OUS portion where we'll talk about some of the global vaccine issues that we are seeing. And you'll see many similar questions, but as always astonishes me, there's so many other issues to consider. So look at this. Here's our poll results. Encourage employees to get the vaccine wins by 73.1%. Not sure at this time is next, 19.7, and mandating is 3.2. This is not inconsistent, as you're going to hear from Condon and Carlo, with what we're seeing generally. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Condon to get started with the Eeoc Guidance portion of our presentation.
Anand, you are on mute.
So
there
much.
you go. Should be good now.
Thanks so much. Thrilled to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to be addressing what many of you know, at least generally, which is that the EEOC has authorized mandatory vaccination of all employees, subject to some caveats that I'll discuss in some detail. Now, when I say that they have authorized mandatory vaccination, that means all employees can be required to be vaccinated in order to be in the workplace. It doesn't mean that they can be required to receive the vaccine as a condition of employment. In other words, if no vaccine, automatic termination. That doesn't follow, and I'll come back to that. The EEOC's guidance in this regard issued late last year, and it was one of the last and I think certainly most important decisions to come out of the prior administration's EEOC. Many were surprised by this. I, for whatever reason, was not, knowing that employers at least wanted this option, and that the three EEOC commissioners involved in issuing the guidance are very much supporters of the employer community. In addition, this is a horrific time. This is an unprecedented pandemic, at least since the Spanish flu of 1918. So you know, the EEOC, although they may operate in something of an ivory tower, was hardly unaware. And in fact, we know that they were in regular communication with the CDC at multiple steps as they issued guidance leading up to the December guidance, initially authorizing questions about symptoms that otherwise would have been prohibited, at least absent proof of direct threat, and then authorizing testing as a condition of returning to the workplace. So they gradually upped the employer's options when things did not get better, and when in fact we saw that surge in the fall, late summer really, starting, that many had predicted and was so horrific. So what are the other caveats? You can't just automatically fire somebody if they don't get the vaccine. You also, in order to mandate the vaccine for everybody, have employees receive a vaccine from an independent third party. What does that mean? Well, it means that really, next slide, please, there can be no contractual relationship between you and the entity that does the vaccination. I should say, just quickly as an overview, that the other major caveat that I will, of course, address is compliance with ADA and Title VII accommodation requirements. ADA as to disability, obviously, and Title VII religious accommodation requirements. But the way that the EEOC really skinned the cat, so to speak, is by mandating that employees receive the vaccine from a third party, because that allows the employer to not be in a position of asking questions that would otherwise be prohibited. In order to safely receive the vaccine, all infectious disease experts agree that individuals must be asked medical questions about their medical history, about possible allergies to vaccination, whether they may otherwise be averse to vaccination. And so those questions would doubtless be prohibited under ADA. Similarly, whether other members of their family members, certainly if you ask questions about family members, those would be ADA prohibited. They're probably GINA prohibited as well. And the questions we see being asked relate to households. But in any event, there are these line of questions that they're on all of the consent forms that are put out by the states, by Walgreens, CVS, for anybody who's going to get the vaccine. Now, no relationship with you means none whatsoever. It can't be your medical department. It can't be your occupational health clinic. It can't be any other health professional whom you regularly use, like a nurse that may be on call to come to your facility. None of those professionals or individuals can be involved in administering the vaccine. It can be administered under your health plan, but of course it has to be with a doctor of the employee's choice. And that's exactly what the EEOC guidance says. Either a doctor of the employee's choice or a commercial third-party provider like Walgreens or CVS or Walmart, or, as we have seen, growing these mass vaccination sites, first called big tents, now they're in so many different forms, including stadiums, that we wouldn't call them big tents, but they are big spaces, and they're providing a lot of shots. Referrals may be okay, referrals to sources that provide the vaccine, but not just to one, because that would indicate that you have some sort of relationship with that one. But if you provide employees with a list of places that they can get vaccinated, I don't think there's any problem with that under the EEOC guidance or otherwise. Conversely, if for whatever reason you want to administer the vaccine yourself by your health professionals on site, or by a clinic that you want to hire to come in on site and do it for reasons of control and quality control and assurance that everybody gets vaccinated in accordance with the CDC schedule, then if you want that level of control, you must be able to prove on a case-by-case basis that any unvaccinated employee in the workplace poses a direct threat to others. That's a really high burden because, as I'm going to mention momentarily, the accommodation requirements probably mean there are going to be unvaccinated employees in the workplace. And what seems to be emerging as the future, even both in regulatory and other terms, is that the vast majority of employees will be vaccinated, and they will probably be working with some unvaccinated employees. Hopefully there will be a level of herd immunity that will protect those unvaccinated employees, and regardless, social distancing and other safety measures will remain in place for some time. But we're not going to see those social distancing or masks disappear, but at least people are going to be able to get back into the workplace in substantial numbers, and not just in critical industries. So it would be virtually impossible to prove, I think, that every employee would pose a direct threat because there's going to be some that are unvaccinated, whether it's due to accommodation or other reasons. Now, lastly, in this regard, I will say, and the EEOC said, that it's okay to offer a vaccine through a voluntary wellness program, and that's an alternative to having a third party administer the vaccine or administering it yourself. So if you had a voluntary program on site that you ran with your health professionals or those with whom you contracted, that's permissible. But then it isn't mandatory, right? It's voluntary, and some people would decline it. I'm not going to get into incentives, but we're seeing a lot of clients offering incentives in the voluntary context to try to incent people to get the vaccine. Next slide, please. As I said, there are two major accommodation-related caveats to the EEOC's guidance, which inevitably follow from a long history of EEO law. The first is the duty to accommodate under ADA. Meg Toth is going to address this in great detail and incredibly helpful detail, and I don't need to say much about it at this point. I will say, though, that it is the case that an employee must have an ADA-covered disability in order to be entitled to request and receive an accommodation under the ADA. And the number of conditions, medical conditions, that disqualify somebody medically from being able to receive the vaccine is quite limited. We may see a number of people claiming those conditions or other conditions that they claim entitle them to an accommodation. One thing we know for sure is that fear of the vaccine itself is not a disability. And there is an incredible level of fear that still remains out there. Depending on the numbers you read, 30%, 40% are still not persuaded that they want to take the vaccine. And for many of them, it's not a religious objection. It's not a disability-related objection. It is just fear. They don't trust it. It's for emergency use, and they just would rather go without it. And that includes some people that are, not just young people, but people middle-aged and older. Next slide, please. The other universe of accommodations that must be provided under ADA, must be provided under EEO law, is the duty to accommodate religious beliefs. Certain religions hold that people should not have anything inserted or injected into their body, and that precludes vaccination. Others don't believe that Western medicine, as we know it, is not really appropriate with the tenets of their faith. So for those individuals, they need to request an accommodation. And if they do, and they say that they have a religious objection, it does have to be legitimate. It does have to be based on a real religious belief, but don't push back on that because you're likely to lose. The EEOC has said that employers generally should not question religious beliefs, and that's based on a long line of court cases that say exactly the same thing. There's not some circuit split or partisan split. It's uniform that you generally should not. Now, if you have some doctor's note that obviously seems fake, maybe you can push back on that. Being an anti-vaxxer, by the way, and there are various terms for that, but that's not a religious belief. So as to those that hold this sincere belief, what can be done to accommodate them? Well, obviously working remotely is one possible accommodation. And you shouldn't reject it out of hand, especially if they've been working remotely during the pandemic. Maybe they didn't before, but now they've been working remotely. You're going to have a tough time showing that they have to be in the office working with others. Not saying you can't require that, but you may have an uphill battle. In fact, though, you do still have, you as the employer still have, next slide please, an undue hardship defense. And it's a lot easier to prove undue hardship under Title VII than it is under ADA. That's a very steep climb under ADA. But under Title VII, the burden need only be more than de minimis. And the fact that most people are vaccinated and only a few are not, and one of those is requesting a religious accommodation might satisfy that burden. But in assessing undue hardship, you always have to consider possible accommodations that would reduce the risk. So if social distancing, masks, and frequent hand washing are generally sufficient to ensure a safe workplace, particularly if most people are vaccinated, it's going to be very hard to prove that just a few unvaccinated people will be a risk and therefore an undue hardship. There is a line of authority that says reasonable accommodations cannot burden others. And employers might be able to hang their hat on that for saying, no, we can't have unvaccinated people in the workplace because that puts vaccinated employees, not at risk, but it puts other unvaccinated employees at risk. If we have some, then we have to have others, and we have others, they're putting each other at risk. They're burdening each other. I don't think that's going to fly, frankly, because the case law in this space talks about burdening others in regard to performing their job in a direct sort of way. I don't think that line of cases is going to apply, but it hasn't been tested yet. Lastly, I'll end with the point, or one point that I started with, which is that EEOC says just because accommodation or ready accommodation isn't possible doesn't mean that termination is automatically the next step. Rather, the employee should perhaps remain on leave until the pandemic abates, if you have a leave process that permits that, or if state or local law, at least for some time, requires that, and there are state and local laws that do. But at the end of the day, if the employee must be at the work site because that is inherently required of the job, it's a manufacturing line environment, it's a team-based interactive workplace where everybody has to be there face to face, then it may not be possible to accommodate, but you should try hard before you reach that conclusion. Thanks.
Thank you, Condon. I think we're turning it now over to Carla.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of a mandatory vaccination program. So what I'm going to talk about on these next 3 slides are things that you can think about if now you are evaluating whether to have a mandatory or voluntary program, or you're going to revisit that issue in the future. So here we have the pros of a mandatory vaccination policy. The first one being that, at least in theory, more people are going to get vaccinated, more employees are going to get vaccinated in your workplace if you require it. So if you think about people who don't have a huge objection to getting vaccinated, but it's not at the top of their list because they don't have any underlying conditions, they're not in a high-risk group of any kind, so they're not in a rush to get vaccinated, you could tip the scales by mandating it. Another pro is that if you mandate the vaccine, you're going to increase morale for the pro-vaccine employees in your workplace, the people who don't want to come back to work and work alongside unvaccinated people. They will be very happy to know that you are mandating the vaccine. Another pro is that you can advertise the fact that you're mandating the vaccine. Depending on the nature of your workplace and the amount of time that your employees spend interacting with the public, it can be very helpful to be able to say, we as employer X mandate the vaccine so you can feel safe coming to our place of business. You have an ice cream shop. This is the safest place to get an ice cream cone in the city because everyone here is vaccinated. The last pro would be demonstrating reasonable care. And there are certainly a lot of employers who are still concerned about workplace exposure to COVID, people contracting COVID, especially as we're all looking to come back to work. And some employers want to be able to say, even though I wasn't required to mandate it, I could mandate it, and I did mandate it because I'm doing everything I possibly can to make this the safest workplace that I can. So those are the pros. Let's go to the next slide. So here is the list of cons. The discerning viewer will note that this list is a bit longer than the list of pros. So first off, on the cons, you may go through the trouble of mandating the vaccine, but it's quite unlikely that you will have a 100% vaccinated workforce. So if your goal is to be able to say that by mandating it, it's unlikely that'll be the case because at a minimum, you have to make exceptions for those with religious and disability related reasons for not getting the vaccine. You'll also have decreased morale for those of your employees who are anti-vaccine, people who have objections for whatever reason, legally protected or not, to getting the vaccine, and will view it as paternalistic, intrusive, an invasion of their privacy for you to mandate them to get the vaccine. Also, with mandating the vaccine comes an increased risk of litigation. We know this already from employers who have mandated the flu vaccine in the past. If you were to go on Westlaw and look up the cases arising out of mandatory flu vaccine policies, you would see that almost all of them arise in the context of someone seeking an exception to the mandatory policy and not getting it and filing a lawsuit over it. So there definitely is an increased risk of litigation if you mandate the vaccine. In connection with that, the requesting of exceptions, you also have to make sure you have stood up an accommodation process under your mandatory vaccine policy. Most of you probably already have some type of accommodation policy for everyday type employment related accommodations, either religious or disability related, that are requested by your employees. But you will find most likely that if you mandate the vaccine, you will be getting a number of requests for accommodation to seek an exception to that requirement. And you need to be able to train your human resources personnel to consider those requests and deal with them appropriately. There's also potential workers' compensation liability if you mandate the vaccine. If all you're doing is encouraging the vaccine and it's a completely voluntary choice on the part of the employee to get vaccinated, then there's really no recourse against the employer if there's an adverse reaction. However, if you are mandating it for your workforce, then there is the possibility, and this is a state-by-state issue under the workers' comp regime, that there could be workers' comp liability for adverse effects to the vaccine. Also, if you're mandating the vaccine, it may be the case that you need to pay for the time spent getting the vaccine, especially if you're not doing some type of on-site clinic for it, and people are going to have to travel to wherever the vaccine is being administered. Also, although Condon has just described for you the authority under the EEOC guidance for mandating the vaccine, that is just an interpretation of federal employment law. There is the question of states' restriction to the vaccine. There could be state law invasion of privacy claims regarding that requirement. There are also a large number of states, almost half the states in the United States, have introduced some kind of legislation that is aimed toward either prohibiting a mandate by employers or restricting a mandate by employers of the COVID vaccine. Lastly, if you mandate a vaccine, you have to be prepared to enforce your policy. And there may be employees who are very important to your organization, otherwise really good employees, who for whatever reason don't want to be vaccinated. And you have to confront the issue of disciplining, potentially up to and including termination, those individuals if you mandate the vaccine for your workplace. Next slide. So here are two questions that I often tell clients they should consider when going through this exercise of determining whether they will mandate the vaccine or simply encourage it. First of all, take a look at your workforce and think very hard about the fact of how many more people are going to get vaccinated if you mandate it. Because a cynic might say that if someone really has a strong objection to getting vaccinated, they're going to come up with some sort of legally protected reason for not taking it. And then you have to ask yourself, if someone comes to me with a potentially legally protected reason for not getting the vaccine, am I going to go through a rigorous process and try to deny some of those requests, knowing that that's where most of the litigation comes from in the mandatory vaccine context? Or am I going to grant any accommodation request that seems legally plausible or factually plausible? And if that's the case, are you really going to get more people vaccinated in your workplace if you mandate the vaccine? And if the reason you're considering mandating the vaccine is so that more people or everybody will be vaccinated in your workforce, you have to think about whether that will be the reality at the end of the day. And lastly, many of our clients are taking the approach that they don't need to decide right now about mandating the vaccine because, one, it's not available to all of their employees right now, and two, some of the really strong resistance to getting the vaccine is coming out of the fact that it's in EUA status. And some of our clients are considering maybe having a mandatory policy farther down the road, once maybe one of the vaccines is fully approved by the FDA. So those are two questions you can ask yourself when considering this question of whether to mandate the vaccine in your workplace or not. So now I'm going to turn this over to Tracy Billow, who is going to talk about OSHA and CDC guidance related to vaccines. Tracy?
Thank you, Carla. I really appreciate it. You know, as all of you know, there's a whole wealth of information with respect to what should be done and not done with respect to vaccines and the safety and efficacy of vaccines and where to get vaccines. Well, perhaps that's the one that's been the most challenging for people, which is where to get the vaccines. Just briefly, the CDC does strongly recommend that people get the vaccine. As many of you probably are already aware, they have created priority eligibility groups related to the vaccine rollout. Do note, though, that most states and local ordinances do sort of put a twist on the CDC guidelines. They may not follow them exactly. They may add some additional categories. So it is important to always monitor your state and local public health authorities' websites for that rollout as well. People ask about educating people about the vaccine. The CDC has a great fact sheet to help educate individuals. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you go to the CDC website. Next slide, please. It has some really key details with respect to information that many people ask. The CDC did issue some guidance for fully vaccinated individuals. I want to be clear here, though, this is not guidance for employers or employment settings. This is general guidance for gatherings, etc. I do think it could be a preview of what we could expect in the employment world, but do note that this is not specifically employment guidance. So fully vaccinated individuals, which is if someone is getting the 2-dose vaccine 2 weeks after their second dose, and if someone's getting the single-dose vaccine 2 weeks after that dose. They can visit other fully vaccinated people indoors, and they don't have to worry about social distancing and wearing masks. They can also visit unvaccinated people from a single household. They will not have to quarantine or test if they are exposed but asymptomatic. However, while I give you all of these things about fully vaccinated individuals, following up on what Condon said and Carla said, and what you've probably all read, states and municipalities have very different rules. So this doesn't necessarily mean all of our lives are going to change simply because the CDC is saying that there is a level of safety now with fully vaccinated individuals. Also, additionally, people should be wearing masks and distance in public, even if they are fully vaccinated. The CDC is still recommending that people avoid medium and large size in-person gatherings, and definitely wear masks and socially distance when you're with multiple households. So just wanted to share this. I think this is a roadmap of what we might see from an employment perspective, but do know, pay attention to what might be coming down the road in terms of the exact guidance. Next slide, please. OSHA, as you know, has been very active in trying to help workplaces determine what are appropriate safety protocols, et cetera. They too have some guidance on the vaccine. They recommend employers make the vaccine available at no cost to employees. They do think employers should provide information and training on the safety of the vaccines. Again, I hearken back to that CDC toolkit and fact sheet that you can use. Last but not least, they do not distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. All still need to follow protective measures in the workplace. And truthfully, from a general sort of rule, distinguishing between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees in the workplace is going to create a whole lot of issues for employers. It can result in discrimination. It can result in people being treated unfairly or differently as a result of it. So certainly we are not recommending anyone ever be identified as the vaccinated group or the unvaccinated group. You never want to be calling those employees out or otherwise doing that. I mean, we've seen some requests, which we get, right? I'd like to give them stickers that they can wear so, they can be proud of what they've done. Unfortunately, though, in this context, you're going to run into some legal employment challenges. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Meg, who's going to start walking you through some of the accommodations considerations related to disabilities. Meg?
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Although some of these issues related to vaccines, disabilities, and reasonable accommodations have already been mentioned throughout the presentation, we wanted to spend some time addressing them in a little bit more detail. This is a very important topic for employers with mandatory vaccine programs. Specifically, if you're requiring employees to have the vaccine, an employee comes forward and says they can't because of a disability, then they may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation. And I'm going to talk about what those types of disabilities might be and types of reasonable accommodations and what that all might look like in a minute. But first, I wanted to address a little bit, in a little bit more detail, the EEOC guidance that Condon was discussing earlier, specifically on this topic. As Condon mentioned, the EEOC has made clear that employees who are not able to get vaccines during or due to a disability, a qualifying disability, where it is being required as a condition of employment, may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation. And that guidance specifically addresses employers' obligations and other considerations for determining whether or not an employee who can't have the vaccine can be reasonably accommodated and whether they're entitled to a reasonable accommodation. So if you can get your hands on that guidance, it's helpful to, it would be helpful to understand. But in short, in a basic summary of that is, what the guidance says is that because the vaccine is a safety-based qualification, meaning that it's required or employers are requiring it for employment for safety reasons, and because it may tend to screen out people who aren't able to get it because of a disability, then the employer must show that the unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat due to a significant risk of substantial harm to the health and safety either of themselves or to other employees. And this is what we call the direct threat assessment, which you've probably heard before. It's not new, it's just what applies in this situation. And to determine whether or not an unvaccinated person poses what we're calling a direct threat, there are 4 factors you must look at. The first is the duration of the risk. And this is really, how long is the person saying that they can't be vaccinated for? And then the other factors include the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. And the reason I've sort of grouped those last 3 factors together is because, there are certain, actual intuitive things you're going to want to look for to assess those 3 factors, which include the nature of the work and the amount of contact the employee is having with others. This can mean, what type of people is the employee coming into contact with? A lot of high-risk people. How frequently are they coming into contact with others? And how many people are they coming into contact with? If they work in a space with 1 to 2 people, or do they work in a space with 50 people? Are they, doing their work in a private office where they're not actually coming into contact with people? Or are they working in a communal workspace? Are they serving customers and clients? Are they in retail or hospitality? A lot of those issues will be very important for this determination of whether or not they actually pose a direct threat. And then another thing, which I know Condon also mentioned, which is related to this disability analysis and the religious accommodation analysis, is how many people in the workplace are vaccinated. The more people that are vaccinated, the less likely there is going to be a direct threat. But after looking at all of these different factors, reaching the conclusion that there actually is a direct threat requires a determination that the unvaccinated individual will actually expose other people to the virus. So that's really what we're looking for when we're looking at all these factors. However, it's important to understand that even if you do determine that the employee poses a direct threat, that you can't automatically exclude them from the workplace. You can't automatically terminate them or take any other action unless you determine there's no way that they could be provided with a reasonable accommodation. And so before we look at some of those reasonable accommodations are, or maybe, I think it's helpful to understand what the disabilities you may be seeing are and what the process is for getting through this. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the examples of disabilities include anxiety, which Condon mentioned. This is not general fear. It's not somebody claiming that they're anxious about the vaccine. This is diagnosed, supported by medical certification type of anxiety. Allergies is another disability that you may see where people are claiming they can't get the vaccine because they are allergic. There is a standard, doctors who are administering the vaccine are going to ask if there's an allergy to a prior vaccine or a specific component of the COVID-19 vaccine. An employee can't say they're allergic to a certain food or, allergic to bees. It actually has to be related to, a component of the vaccine or a prior vaccine that indicates they may have a severe allergic reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine. There are also certain autoimmune disorders that may, be out there that preclude people from getting the vaccine. And it's also important to understand that this is a new vaccine, so there may be other disabilities or other medical conditions that come up that we, soon or later, we realize that people with those conditions shouldn't be getting the vaccine. And so the process here in terms of figuring out, is it a qualifying disability? Can we accommodate this person? You must follow the standard ADA process that you're used to for any, the typical disabilities. This includes the interactive process, conducting an individualized assessment to figure out, what exactly the circumstances of each employee is. You can and you should ask for supporting medical documentation that shows the employee actually cannot get the vaccine due to a medical condition. And then another important aspect of the process is to train managers and train supervisors who are responsible for communicating with employees about their compliance or participation in a mandatory vaccine program, because it's important that those supervisors and managers can identify an accommodation request and that they know what to do with those requests when they come in. So once you go through this process, you'll see on the next slide, we've put out some possible reasonable accommodations that you can consider, which includes masks. And, for now, people are probably going to be wearing masks regardless of vaccinations. But, down the road, if you still have unvaccinated people and, you could require mask wearing, continued testing of that employee so that they're able to enter the workplace safely and minimize the risks. Social distancing measures, to continue those on. Remote work, as Condon mentioned as well. Can the employee continue to, or can they move to a remote work arrangement so they minimize their exposure to other employees? Are there alternative work hours or alternative work schedules the employee can work in order to minimize their exposure to other people? A leave of absence can be a reasonable accommodation. I'll talk about that one in just a minute. And then any combination of the above. So it may be a matter of getting a little bit creative and allowing an employee to work remotely a couple of days and, come in on an alternative schedule on other days with a mask. So there are options here. And now on the next slide, talking about some other, the leave of absence issue in terms of reasonable accommodation and other issues related. A leave of absence can be a reasonable accommodation as it can be in other situations under the ADA, but I did want to point out that indefinite leave is still not a reasonable accommodation in this situation either. So the leave of absence that's being requested, it must be reasonably short in duration, and that sort of indefinite leave analysis should factor in. I also wanted to note with regards to employees who are saying that they can't take the vaccine because they are pregnant or breastfeeding. This is a little bit of a gray area because I think, the medical industry or authorities sort of diverge or aren't necessarily consistent in terms of whether or not the vaccine is safe for these types of individuals. I wouldn't necessarily recommend engaging in a medical debate with people who say that they can't get it because of pregnancy or breastfeeding, but this is a situation where that supporting medical documentation will be important. And if their doctor says that they can't get it for these reasons, then I would accept that at what it says and not engage in any debate there. And then finally, last but certainly not least, I did want to point out that there are various state and local paid leave laws that may come into play with vaccines, not exactly related to accommodations, but there are a number of paid sick leave and state and local laws out there that mandate leave for side effects if those are coming up. And then somewhat recently, and in particular in New York, and we'll see if other laws like this come up, but there are specific laws that are now mandating paid time off to get the vaccine. So it's very important to be on the lookout for those types of laws, like I said, in New York. And then there are also sort of wage benefit laws that provide paid time off under hazard or hero pay, mostly in California. So very important to be on the lookout for those issues as well. And so this wraps up the U.S. portion of the program today, and I'm going to turn it over to Tessa to kick off the global portion.
Great, thank you, Meg. So interesting. Let's go on to our agenda. Now, the rest of the world is quite a big place, so we're going to do less of a deep dive than Meg and Tracy and the US team have done, but we really just wanted to bring out some of the big differences that we're seeing in the other regions, in particular Europe and APAC compared to the US. Some of these concepts, I think, will be a bit familiar to you when we're talking about accommodations, for instance, when we're talking about discrimination, but there are some really crucial differences. So we're just going to try and flag some of those with you, and some traps for the unwary. So we'll start off, my colleague Jana will just kind of give us a landscape. Where are we in terms of vaccination status? How relevant is it? And then I will pick up some of the kind of key day-to-day issues, and then Paul Catrone, my colleague in Australia, is going to highlight some of the OSHA issues outside of the US. So let's kick off with Jana.
Thanks, Tessa. So seeing that most of you are interested only in encouraging employees to get the vaccines, we'll focus less on mandatory vaccination and more on encouraging and having discussions with employees about vaccination when we talk about the landscape outside the United States. Essentially, much like we see here, access and supply is controlled by the government in pretty much every location. Access has been slow to varying degrees and limited to priority groups in rollouts that are structured similarly to what we see here. So frontline workers, vulnerable populations, et cetera, get the vaccine first. Generally, governments are not mandating vaccines for the entire population and are not committing to mandating vaccines once vaccines become more widely available. That said, there has been varied dosage status. The recent numbers show that the U.S. is actually not doing that badly in terms of getting such a large population vaccinated on the basis of doses per 100 people. Some other countries that are doing fairly well are the UK with 41 doses per 100. Possibly a surprising one is the UAE with 71 doses. As of the most recent data, Israel, we have heard about for quite some time now, has done a really good job of getting, getting the doses out to their population. Of course, a lot of the countries that have managed to do well are smaller countries. So Serbia has done well too with 30, Chile with 42, and then we start to see the numbers drop after that with Turkey, Estonia, Denmark, Morocco, all under 20, and then the rest of the world really under 10. So there's varied speed with which we can anticipate that there'll be any talk about mandating vaccines at all, because right now it just isn't possible to get your employees vaccinated. They have to wait for the government to allow them, and they have to wait for the dosages to come in. In the meantime, businesses are reopening. We've seen Asia move into reopening in particular. We've seen some businesses obviously never shut down, and the way they're doing that is with existing measures and reliance on things like PPE, social distancing, masking, testing, temperature checks, all the things that we've been living with for the last year. And so there's a question pretty much in every location, like we see here in the U.S., of, why would vaccines be mandated or essential for your business if you've managed so far? Obviously, vaccines would be helpful for some businesses more than others, especially anyone in frontline sectors, healthcare, policing, environments. Are looking at moving into encouraging and possibly even mandating vaccinations sooner than others. And we're expecting that all over the world it will be more difficult for a private enterprise to require vaccines without a specific law. Typically, that would be governing a sector that has more of a need, like the healthcare sector or frontline sector. Cultural norms and employee expectations. It's a strongly held belief in many jurisdictions, particularly in the U.S., but also elsewhere, that the employer has no right to require vaccines or to even really enter into a discussion about bodily autonomy with the employee, and that is sometimes grounded in human rights concerns, fundamental freedoms concerns. So we can expect that, again, absent government mandates, excuse me, employers really have not a place in the discussion. We've seen the NHS in the UK that the government has mooted, making it mandatory for the National Health Service workers and some others has mooted making sure that they get vaccinated on a mandatory basis. And there's been a lot of pushback from the workers and from unions and various stakeholders saying this feels invasive. In other locations, in other regions in APAC, people are more comfortable with doing what the employer says, doing what the government says. Culturally, there's going to be less pushback. So you may need to look at different programs in Europe versus LATAM and APAC. LATAM is somewhere in between APAC and the EU in terms of cultural acceptance of being told by the employer what to do with your body. And I think lastly, I think employer representative bodies will always want to have a say. So you'll need to think about whether you have any of those and whether you need to consult with them. You may not be required by law to consult if you're encouraging rather than mandating, but you want to consider it as an employee relations issue. And given that there's no at-will employment outside of the U.S., discipline and termination for vaccine refusal is unlikely to be justifiable, and even some reassignment or modification of duties is going to be more difficult in the U.S. than in the U.S. due to the contractual nature of employment elsewhere. And vaccine acceptance and refusal for refusal of specific vaccinations we've seen as an issue, even though there's the approval status further along for several vaccines in many countries than here in the U.S. So here we have people saying they want to wait till a full FDA approval. Elsewhere, there is approval, and we're still seeing there are strong movements against mandatory vaccination and against vaccination in general. And employees will generally feel if they're mandated by the government or by the employer, we can expect more of a pushback because it feels more skepticism about the process. So I will pass the wand to Tessa now.
I think it is really worth, in this context, more than any really, it's really worth taking into account those cultural differences. And even within Europe, there's a temptation to think in Europe vaccine availability and attitudes will be the same. In fact, the UK is in a very different place in terms of expecting to have all adults vaccinated by July, all over 50s this month, and also vaccine acceptance than Europe, where the rates are extremely low. And there's a lot of skepticism about the main vaccine, which is sitting on the shelves not used, the AstraZeneca vaccine, for political and other reasons. So it's really worth taking that into account. There is definitely a high reluctance culturally, but also related to kind of current issues. So do take the temperature in the non-scientific sense before approaching things locally. Next slide, please. So as Jana said, generally there's no mandate from governments and employers really have to follow suit. There's a couple of rare exceptions. I saw that Brazil, the Supreme Court, had said you could consider that the vaccine would be essential. A couple of other countries, I know parts of Australia, Switzerland, have thought about it, but what we're expecting is that will be a very slow process and it may be only sector specific. So it's really the onus is on employers to make a decision. Also, a point of difference from the US, we don't expect employers to get involved in administering the vaccine at all for the foreseeable future. This will be an entire state sort of process. So US policies that talk about financial assistance or safe administration and so on just won't be relevant generally outside of the US. Similarly, points around paid time off and so on. Generally, people will have those rights anyway. It's not a massive incentive to them to say, take 2 hours paid out of the day, take sick leave if you have side effects. In most of these countries, certainly across Europe, a lot of Latin America, that's a right anyway. So just worth being aware of that. As Jana said, the scope for people to refuse is much greater, subject in some countries to kind of minimum service. So it's not just discrimination, but those factors that my US colleagues were so interestingly talking about for ADA and so on, almost apply to your entire working population, I would say, especially in Europe. So that concept of sort of reasonableness, do we really need to do this? Are there accommodations we could make to avoid a vaccine being essential? You really should be applying that logic across your workforce. But layered on top of that, there is clearly an extra discrimination risk, and again, some differences outside of the US. We have a sort of broader concept in some senses, especially in Europe. So there's a possibility of an argument, in particular in Europe, that if a certain section of the population finds it harder to meet a standard, that if you impose that standard, you are indirectly discriminating against that group and would need to justify it. And statistically, certainly in Europe, there's a big difference between take-up of the vaccine among the Caucasian population and the Black and minority ethnic population. And we are wondering if that will be an argument if employers were to think about mandating vaccination. I know some in the UK are, although it's risky in very early days. That is a potential risk, not just disability, not just belief or religion, which we think is going to be a tough one to run outside the US, but you know, that impact that certain parts of the community are much less likely to have the vaccine and have sort of trust in the system. So do be aware of that. It's a higher burden to justify that. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but I think it's this kind of standards Meg was talking about, plus some, probably. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah, so just want to draw a distinction. There is a lower risk, I think, for both the contractors and for new hires. And where there's been publicity, in particular in the UK, some high-profile employers have said they're going to insist on vaccination. They are generally doing that, and to some extent it may be publicity. It's still very early days for it, but we think they're generally doing that more for new hires. You still have that discrimination argument, but you don't have the general concept of reasonableness, what's called sort of trust and confidence between the employer and employee for new hires. So it's slightly less risky. Also, you don't need to clearly terminate or discipline someone if they can't meet that condition. Whereas for existing employees, on the right-hand side of the slide, as Jana said, people are not employed at will. So for a start, you have much more process outside of the US, in particular in Europe, than you do in the US. If you're going to introduce a kind of policy or consistent approach across the business, that will definitely be something that will need approval of your Works Council. If you have one, they're very common in countries like Germany, Netherlands, France, not so much the UK. And then at an individual level, what will you do with that person who's refusing? They are very likely to have an expensive termination claim, or at least good arguments that would end in probably a costly settlement at this stage, at least until we have clearer guidance. And I think we have less guidance than the US does at the moment from bodies like the EEOC. So you definitely have to go to all those lengths of considering alternatives, changing duties, and in particular, given perhaps more than in the US, folks in particular in Europe have pivoted very much to remote working over this period. It's going to be hard to answer the question, well, why can't I just remote work for a longer period? We'll give you one example of where that argument may not work in a moment. And just wants to flag, Jana will mention from a privacy aspect, the issue of vaccine passports, as well as incentives if there's time. So the concept that the government may have some kind of system which tracks people's status, which may legitimize it. Next slide, please. So briefly, we have heard from some US clients they're thinking about incentives or encouraging vaccination. A couple of countries, certainly in Latin America, I've seen are quite open to that. That's more common, or it's already had kind of blessing from the courts or governments. That's much rarer, I'd say, in Europe. And there is a possibility that by encouraging, but actually even going further and incentivizing, you're taking on a liability you don't need to. I'll give you an example. In France, if you're taking any measure that kind of goes towards people's health and telling them what to do, you're supposed to have the approval, the formal approval from the labour doctor, so the employer's third party kind of retained doctor. So there's a lot more process involved in doing that. We're generally, we're seeing a lot of clients encouraging, but to go beyond that and get more directive, set up, tell people how to go about it, to incentivize, could be a step too far. As I mentioned, the points around paid time off, and I think liability, which Paul will talk about, probably are quite similar. I also wanted to flag that we're already seeing cases of people having disability protection for long COVID. How that plays into vaccination, I don't know. I think potentially you can still have the vaccination, but that's probably going to be a disability and protected in Europe. Next slide, please. So one quite interesting example we thought of where you might be able to justify mandatory vaccination. What about people who have to travel for a living? I saw someone had asked a question as to whether airlines are going to insist on vaccination. I've certainly seen that a couple have said that they will. So when we get back to the normal world and people get back on planes, sales folks, people who work in matrix organizations who need to see each other, if someone says I can't travel, or I don't feel safe, or if physically they cannot get on the airplane because they're not vaccinated, is that a justification for termination? That will be an interesting one. We think that possibly could be a case where you can justify it, although clearly people have switched to Zoom and the rest of it over this period. How far can you kind of make accommodations? So that might be an example. It raises a couple of other issues. I saw that China, for instance, is saying they'll only let people in if they've had a Chinese vaccine, which is, I don't think is approved yet in Europe, for instance, and people will have already had a different vaccine. There may be some scientific issues about having multiple vaccines. That would need to be looked at. So there's a lot of complexity around that. There's also the question of whether one vaccine works against variants which are popping up in different countries. The Brazil variant, the UK had one. So there, I think we still need to tread warily with international travel, but that may be an area where we see that potentially being more able to sort of be justified in the future. And there are issues there also clearly about privacy, which Jana will look at. Africa, by the way, I also saw had announced that they will, a number of countries there have said that they don't want people crossing borders unless they can show vaccination, but we're a long way off, the vaccine reaching that state of being rolled out on the African continent, but that's clearly in the future. Right, I think we can move back to Jana to just spend a few minutes outlining some of the privacy considerations, which clearly are very different from the US. Jana.
Thanks, Tessa. Yeah, it's very ambitious of Africa to make proclamations like that, given that they have some of the lowest numbers and dosages per capita. So we'll have to wait and see on that for probably some time. So the privacy considerations are fairly obvious. We're talking about medical data, which as we probably all know, is particularly sensitive. It falls into the special category of data across Europe under the GDPR and similar regimes that exist elsewhere. The main difference that we can all think about when we think about asking employees about vaccine status or processing any of the information related to vaccine status, keeping records of vaccine status, really doing anything related to information on an employee's vaccination or other medical status, it is that in Europe, we need to follow a GDPR analysis and comply with the local law, the local data protection law. So often that will be if you have any kind of program asking for vaccination status or processing vaccination data, you'll need to work with your data privacy officer, privacy office, compliance office, whoever owns data protection and data privacy in your organization. And in Europe, we generally cannot rely on employee consent because in the context of the employment relationship, it is, of course, inherently coercive due to the imbalance of power between employee and employer. Elsewhere, it may be easier to collect and process data for various purposes on the basis of employee consent. But we still have to think about generally about whether or not you need the data and for what purpose. So, you know, in Europe, the analysis is probably something to do with legitimate interest, and for health data, the additional considerations for whether there's a public health condition or some other condition for processing that is that meets the enhanced requirements for a special category of sensitive medical data. In some cases, it may be necessary to conduct processing via health professionals and implement additional confidentiality measures, of course. Overarchingly, I think for most jurisdictions outside the US, and particularly in Europe, we need to think about transparency. So being very clear with the employee why the data needs to be collected, what is the purpose of your collection, and really thinking that through specifically for your organization, how long you'll be keeping the data, what you'll use it for, and potentially thinking about whether you need to do a data privacy impact assessment under the local law or under your data privacy program internally, particularly if you're processing vaccination data on a mass scale. There are local law considerations on whether the employer is allowed to or required to share the data with the relevant health authority. In some cases you are, in some cases you're absolutely not. And also for US multinationals, it's important to remember that the data ideally in many countries should be located locally and not transferred out. And so if you have systems that will transfer the data out, you need to comply with local law on data transfers. And for compliance with law and also best practices, minimize the data that's not only the data that's collected, but particularly the data that's transferred out, and really think about, do I need to transfer all the data that's collected out of the jurisdiction to where I may do some further processing, and what are the mechanisms of protection for that transfer? Which you know, could be mechanisms, it could be relying on mechanisms you already have implemented for data transfer, for instance, out of Europe. You know, some of the familiar concepts are relying on standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules for your organization. Now, another thing to mention is that even outside of the main data privacy conscious jurisdictions, like the European jurisdictions and locations in APAC and LATAM that have GDPR-style laws or omnibus privacy laws, we also have impacts in jurisdictions that you may not be thinking of. For instance, some Islamic states that follow Sharia law will have privacy rights for individuals that protect secrets, and they may even criminalize the use of secret or personal information or invasion of private life. So we have to think about whether in those locations gathering this information and sharing it or distributing it, including with your parent company back in the US or elsewhere, or for instance, HR managers in a region in a different entity, constitutes breach of people's privacy rights. And one final thought I wanted to add was on data retention issues. So this is really just an extension of protecting and balancing people's privacy rights. So to the extent that we collect this data as an employer and are keeping it for some time, we need to make sure under many of the laws in existence, thinking about GDPR, but also lots of other omnibus laws have criteria for this. We must keep the data accurate. We have to limit the use, limit the purposes of the collection, and further use. Notify people if we're going to be changing the purposes of the use, and securely deleting any data that's becoming obsolete. So these are all the kind of data stewardship, record retention, data security concepts that you may already have in place as part of your data protection program and data retention programs, but given the additional sensitivities of vaccination data, we may need to modify some of the internal rules we have in place prior to just kind of getting the data, parking it for a long time. It'll be important to regularly review whether you still have grounds for the continued collection and retention of vaccine-related data as the pandemic situation changes, as vaccine uptake and availability become less of an issue. Several states, governments have issued proclamations on pandemic status. So once that pandemic status falls away, it may be necessary to revisit whether you need vaccine data in a given jurisdiction and whether you can still justify keeping it. And that's it for me. And I will be passing the wand on to Paul.
And before we pass to Paul, I just want to flag, I see we've had a few questions about whether you can ask employees to prove they've had vaccinations and keep a record. I just wanted to capture that. It's a very tricky issue. A few countries, surprisingly, possibly can if it's really spot on relevant to the role and you can justify it. But for now, I think we'd say the majority you can't. And as Jana said, the principle will be, even when the rules kind of ease up a bit on that, that you do it to the absolute minimum in terms of how you keep that, what record you keep. Sorry, Paul, to eat into your time. I wanted to capture that because I know some people had questions, but I'll sign over to you now.
No trouble. Thank you. I think that's a really important issue to address, Tessa. So thank you, and thank you, Jana, and the other speakers as well. So I'm not going to try and cover the field in terms of international health and safety matters. That's why I've called it considerations, and really just going to cherry pick a few issues for you to consider. One of the common questions that comes up is around, can a single global approach be taken? And I think the first thing to do with that question is to step back and recognise that in terms of this particular risk, and by that I mean COVID-19, not just dealing straight with the vaccination issue, is that it's a public risk issue that then drifts into the workplace context. And outside of the US, and no doubt in the US as well, employers or organisations have a duty to ensure the health and safety of their workers and visitors and others who are affected by their work activities. And obviously that's qualified, and the word ensure doesn't always appear everywhere, but the context is really about trying to make the place of work safe. And outside of the US, and also obviously inside it, but outside the US, which is what I'm mainly focusing on, is there is sometimes more acute criminal liability in terms of driving a safe place of work and putting in place appropriate processes to eliminate or minimise the risks of COVID-19. And so on that basis, there's often that challenge of wanting to drive to a more simplified approach to organisations that operate in multiple jurisdictions. And one of the comments I'd make there is that in principle, there is an opportunity for a single global approach, but it always needs to defer to the local law of the country. And often for those of you who have operations outside of the US and operate in various countries, you'll know that even within a country, that can then be further drilled down to by states, territories, jurisdictions have their own subtle nuances about how laws are imposed. And so I think it's really important that if you do decide to try and adopt as much as possible a single global approach to this risk, whether it's standards, principles, policy, it's very important that that policy, that framework allows some flexibility, or as we say, flexibility within that framework, meaning that it defers to the local laws and is responsive to the local laws, so there's no inadvertent drift into any criminal or civil liability because of some inflexibility in terms of the approach being adopted. Now, the other thing I think is important is to think about the fact that vaccination is potentially, or is in fact, a risk control measure. Where that sits in the type of hierarchy of controls, I'm getting various different views from different people about that. And from that perspective, there'll be some, I think, conjecture still going forward about that. But what we're seeing is outside of the US is that there is really a need to have the combination of control measures being applied as well. Now, you're getting a lot of variability about how that works. So, for instance, I think everyone's touched on outside of Europe the supply issue. So obviously there are varying levels of supply within countries, and there are other control measures that are being used. And I find it really interesting. You hear the term social distancing. Some jurisdictions talk about physical distancing, and in the workplace, often the view is it's physical distancing because of obviously the distinction between the social element and the work element. And on that basis, physical distancing, or as some may want to also call it social distancing, is a control measure, but it is subject to its own weaknesses and error in people breaching those guidelines. There are issues around PPE, for instance. In some jurisdictions, PPE is not always recognised. And what I mean by that, for example, in the UK, for instance, there's a very clear position that's been put out around, for instance, the fact that face coverings may not necessarily be considered as PPE in certain circumstances. And it really goes to affect the specifications of the face covering or mask that might be determined. In others jurisdiction, the view is it is recognised. And so it's really important to understand that there is really a range of controls that can be used, including sanitisation and ventilation and issues, personal hygiene, etc. And what we're finding is obviously is the view that's being taken is that vaccination is one control measure amongst a combination of other controls, and particularly where supply is an issue, but also just generally it's still intended to be used in terms of in combination with other control measures until we get a little bit more line of sight onto the efficacy, effectiveness of that approach. Now, in terms of one of the key aspects that I think is quite universal to a large extent is the risk management process. Meg talked about that in the context of her discussions around discrimination and other areas. A risk assessment, in my view, is going to be a critical document. It'll be a critical process in terms of demonstrating the harm, the likelihood, the control measures that should be assigned, the effectiveness of those controls, and in many respects will be a key document in any sort of litigious or criminal prosecution process to justify a proper structured and technical approach to the application of managing the risk in the workplace. So I think that's really critical. And another area is obviously change management, because we are getting new information, and including the variations that we're seeing with this virus, that risk assessments have to be dynamic, as the risk it's dealing with is a dynamic risk. And so it's important that there are good risk management processes and good change management processes that respond to that. And often you'll find those processes are already embedded within your organisation's OSHA or health and safety frameworks, and they're quite capable of responding to this health risk and safety risk like any other health and safety risk, and should be applied in the conventional way, but be obviously flexible enough to deal with any variability in that context. The other areas I'll just very quickly talk about is that there is a lot around subject matter experts and access to that subject matter expertise. Obviously, the more technically and scientifically defendable the approach you take based on empirical evidence is going to be stronger legally. And it's very important that the subject matter experts and the expertise you access very much focuses on staying within their lanes and not seeking legal advice from a scientist and scientific advice from lawyers. It really is making sure you have good, solid, empirical, technical and scientific advice to base your decision making on. The final 2 points I just really want to talk about is there can be executive and director liability exposure in certain jurisdictions, and that is around overseeing the effectiveness of the safe workplace. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but it's something to be mindful of outside of the US, and in some jurisdictions it can be criminal, and that can often be minimised in circumstances where there's good reporting, oversight, monitoring of the controls, the effectiveness of the controls, of how those risks are being managed across the organisation, good governance processes. Some businesses set up specific governance processes around this area. Other build it within their existing health and safety reporting and governance cadences that they operate to. And obviously assurance processes are critical. We can't just trust, we must verify, as has been quoted in, I think, a Russian proverb and some US presidents. And I think it's really important that's maintained and that vigilance occurs. So I'll stop on that note and hand over to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all of our OUS colleagues for that great summary. So we're going to close out the webinar with a rapid fire Q&A to highlight the differences between the US and OUS law on vaccines in the workplace, just to sort of synthesize what we've heard. Before we turn to that, I just want to mention we're going to be sending out a survey to those who registered for this webinar after the webinar, probably tomorrow, next few days, asking what other topics you want to hear about vaccine related from us. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and just with the volume of attendees and the content, we weren't able to have a Q&A session, but we're going to look at those questions in determining what are the next topics that we might want to address along with the survey results. And of course, feel free to reach out to your Seyfarth relationship attorney about any questions you might have about the content today. This will just be a rapid fire Q&A with Paul, Tessa, and I. So question one is just, what are most employers doing in terms of vaccines in the workplace? And in the US, it's just like you saw it in the poll that Tracy did at the outset. Vast majority are just encouraging the vaccine. Small minority are mandating. Tessa, Paul? Tessa, you're muted.
Can I be unmuted? Thanks. So I'd say that generally, outside the, such a cliche now, isn't it? You're muted. Outside the US, especially in Europe, I would say employers are doing nothing. And the reason for that is that people who can get the vaccine, say in the UK, are generally pretty keen. people in Europe are hesitant, so they wouldn't be seen to want to be sort of pushing it too far. So I think it's a lot of wait and see. Although I know in the UK some employers are keen to mandate in certain sectors, people are holding fire, would be my impression.
Okay, so related to that, the second question is, if they want to, is it even possible for employers to mandate the vaccine? And of course, in the US, the answer is easy. Any employer can mandate the vaccine as long as they follow the rules about letting the employees get it from a third party and accommodating religious and disability related objections. How about in the OUS context?
Yeah, definitely less straightforward, generally OUS. I don't think generally employers are going to be able to mandate unless they can really look at their sector and role. But any employer who does that is going to be on the cutting edge. So I think a lot of our clients would prefer to wait and see and are hoping to avoid it entirely, I think, unless they're in a high-risk sector. Paul, anything to add for you?
Yeah, I think that's a good summation. Thanks, Tessa. And I think the OSHA space can help push that narrative along a little more. But effectively, I think it would have to be risk management based, but it really is still quite opaque.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say I don't think we have discrimination protection for like anti-vaxxer views. I don't know if that's the case for you, Carla, but that's not going to be a general feature, I would say, outside the US.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic in the US. Vaccination status isn't protected under the law. But if the reason that you're not vaccinated is because you have a disability or a religious objection, there could be a discrimination issue if there's adverse employment action. And of course, you know, we have the 50 states and about half of them have introduced bills that would make discrimination based on vaccination status illegal. So always interesting and evolving, as I'm sure it is there. Last question, can employers require their employees to give proof of vaccination? Here in the US, that's permissible under federal employment law. Again, states may have different views. We're seeing bills introduced to prevent this. There could be privacy issues. How about in the OUS?
Yeah, I mean, generally not, certainly at this stage. I think we might see that changing when the scientific evidence is pretty clear, when a majority of people have had it. The other big game changer for us, I think, will be governments rolling out sort of COVID passports. There are questions around that. There's a digital green pass I think Europe's talking about. Israel has one. Singapore has an app. The question for me, and the privacy folks like Yana will be more expert, is if it's a state-run app or controlled, can the employer even access that? If it can and it's being centrally stored, that might be a game changer, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I know you and some colleagues have some great thought leadership coming out on our blogs about vaccine passports. I'm going to do a whole series on that, so that'll be very interesting to hear. Okay, well, I think we're up on our time, and I'm going to need to read the CLE code. If we can put that up on the screen, I'll read it as well. So the CLE code is S as in Sam, 5548. That's S as in Sam, 5548. On behalf of the firm and the Labor and Employment Department, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. And we look forward to pushing out other great content to you that's vaccine related. So look for that survey we're going to be sending. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are attending from. Thank you so much.